The morning the stage left her at the edge of the Calipoya River, the rain was doing what rain does in Oregon in November. Not falling so much as settling, a gray, unbroken weight pressing everything flat and still. The driver hadn't waited. He'd pulled the team around before her bag hit the ground, and the sound of the wheels on the river road faded faster than she expected. She stood on the bank with her traveling bag over one shoulder and a canvas tube of rolled papers under her other arm, and she looked at what the advertisement in the Eugene City Guardian had called a productive timber operation in need of an experienced manager. She had read that notice 4 times by lamplight in the back room of a boarding house, where she'd been mending shirts for $1.25 a week for the past 2 months. The words productive and experienced had seemed honest enough at the time. She had folded the paper along its original crease and walked to the telegraph office that same afternoon. What she was looking at now was not productive in any recent sense of the word. The main saw shed had a canvas patch over its northeast corner. The flume that ran water from the mill pond to drive the saw blade had a section of trough missing entirely. She could see daylight through the gap from where she stood on the bank, 30 feet away. A team of oxen stood in the yard untended, their breath rising in slow white columns, patient in the way animals are patient when they have been waiting long enough to stop expecting anything. He came out of the office building when she was halfway across the yard. She had expected an older man. The advertisement had read like something written by a man who had been managing things for a long time and had grown tired of it. But the person walking toward her was not old. He was perhaps 35, possibly younger under the weather, and the particular kind of tired that settles into a man's face when he has been fighting something alone for too long. He wore a canvas jacket that had belonged to someone broader in the shoulder. She noticed that before she noticed anything else. He said her name as a question, the way a man reads a name off a telegram when he is not sure he is pronouncing it right. She said yes and shook his hand and waited. He said the arrangement was straightforward. She would manage the accounts, oversee the crew schedule, handle correspondence with buyers, room and board and a wage to be agreed upon. He said the word agreed the way people say a word they have repeated so many times it has lost its weight. She asked if she could see the mill first. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, of course. The interior of the saw shed was exactly what the canvas patch on the roof had promised. Cold, damp in the corners, the smell of wet sawdust and old iron, and underneath those something else, the particular stillness of machinery that has been sitting longer than it should. The main blade was a good size, an upright muley, saw capable of handling old-growth fir if the water pressure held. She put her hand on the frame and looked up at the guide rail, rust along the lower third, not through the metal yet, but working at it. The equipment was not ruined, it was only stopped. She took her time. She walked the full length of the shed. She looked at the log deck outside the north door where a dozen logs sat waiting, bark still on, diameter consistent. Someone had sorted them before the stopping. That told her something about whoever had run this place before everything went quiet. He stood near the door and watched her without offering explanations or apologies. She noted that most men in that situation filled the silence with one or the other. She came back to where he stood and asked about the flume. He said one section had rotted through in September. He hadn't had the men to replace it. She asked how many men he had. He said 3 now, down from 7 in the spring. She asked why. He was quiet for a moment in the way that isn't evasion, but is arithmetic performed without confidence. He said wages had been short since June. 2 men had gone upriver to the Applegate operation. 2 others he didn't explain, and she didn't ask. She had learned that asking why men left a struggling place was like asking why water found low ground. It was rarely one reason, and never a simple one. She asked about the logs on the deck. He said they'd been cut the previous month from the east stand. He'd kept the crew working the timber, even while the mill sat idle, because the supply contract required delivery by January, and he hadn't found the right words to tell the buyer the mill wasn't running. She looked at him then, the way she'd been taught to look at a patient before asking the question the patient already feared. He did not look like a man who had given up. He looked like a man trying to solve a problem he didn't yet understand the shape of. She said she would take the room if it was still available, and they could discuss wages in the morning. The room was behind the partition wall in the office building, barely large enough for the rope bed and a small table with a tin pitcher on it. The window faced the mill pond. In the early dark, she could see the water moving slow and black under the rain. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at what she had agreed to. She was not in the habit of regret. It used up space she needed for other things. In the morning, she was at the desk before he came through the door. He had made coffee, and he brought a second cup without being asked and set it at the edge of the desk without interrupting what she was reading. She noticed that small things were where character actually lived. What she was reading was the ledger he had left on the desk the night before. In the way a man leaves out something he has stared at so long he forgets others might see it differently. The ledger was in 2 hands. The first ran from the front of the book through roughly 2/3 of the pages, a compact, slanted script that moved quickly across each line with the confidence of someone who had written down numbers every day for years. It stopped in the middle of a page in April. The second hand, his, was more careful and deliberate, the way a person writes when they are concentrating. His entries ran from May through the present, thinner in the dry months. She looked at the April page where the first hand stopped. No note, no closing entry, just a row of figures and then nothing, and on the next page his handwriting picking up without a gap, the way a song continues when the singer changes. She asked him how long his brother had been gone. He looked up from the doorway where he'd been standing with his cup. She said the ledger, 2 hands. He said 8 months. He said it the way a person says a number they've been told represents time, but that doesn't yet feel like time. She said she was sorry and she meant it plainly and didn't add anything to it, because additions were usually for the benefit of the person speaking. He came and sat in the other chair. She ran down the columns again, this time not at the totals but at the pattern. The mill had been profitable through last year, not extravagantly but steadily, the kind of steadiness that comes from a man who knew what his equipment could do and did not push it past that. The supply contracts were consistent. Same buyer, a company in Portland called Hargrove Lumber, every season since the ledger's first page. She looked at the most recent entries. The Hargrove contract had a delivery date in the notes column, January 15th. She asked how many board feet that contract called for. He said 80,000. She looked at the October log deck entry, 32 logs cut and waiting. She did the arithmetic without paper. She said, "You're about halfway." He said he knew. She said, "And the mill isn't running." He said he knew that too. Outside, the rain had let up for the first time in 3 days. The mill pond caught the thin gray morning light and held it flat and still. She asked if there were other records, personal notes his brother had kept, a separate book. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and went to the shelf behind the desk where 3 books leaned against a coffee tin. He brought them over. 2 were surveying manuals, well used, the spines cracked from being opened flat. The third was smaller, bound in dark cloth, the spine creased deep. She opened it. It was not a ledger. It was something between a journal and a working notebook, the kind a man keeps when he is thinking through a problem and needs the page to push back. The entries were dated only by season, written in the same slanted hand she recognized from the ledger. She read slowly. He had been planning something. That was clear from the first page. The notes described timber stands to the south of the main property, land the mill did not own but that backed against the property line. There were sketches of the terrain, rough but precise, the work of someone who had walked the ground many times. Underneath the sketches, calculations, volume by species, projected yield if the timber was cut on rotation, years 1 through 5 laid out in columns. She turned pages. The further she read, the more it took shape. He had been negotiating an expansion, not a land purchase, something more careful. A cutting agreement with the family who owned the south parcel, a family named Whitfield, who had no use for the timber but had resisted selling the land itself. He had been working the conversation slowly. The way a careful man works a problem, not pushing, just staying present. Near the back of the book, one page was different from the others. The writing was faster, the letters looser, as though written in some urgency. A meeting in Portland. A buyer, not Hargrove, a different company, one she didn't recognize, who had expressed interest in a long-term supply arrangement if the South Timber could be secured. The terms were laid out in his hand: volume, price per board foot, delivery schedule spread across 3 years. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was slightly unsteady with something she couldn't name, he had written, "Contract ready to sign. Meeting scheduled May 14." She looked at the ledger. His entries began in May. She closed her eyes once and opened them again. The meeting had been 4 days after his brother died. She set the notebook down and looked at the wall. He was watching her from across the desk. She said, "Your brother had a contract nearly ready with a Portland company, separate from Hargrove." She turned the notebook toward him. "Did you know about this?" He looked at the page for a long time without speaking. He said he hadn't known the details. He'd known his brother had been planning something, had said as much the last time they spoke, but he hadn't explained it. He said they hadn't been the kind of brothers who explained things to each other. They had just shown up and worked. She heard what was underneath that and did not press it. She said, "The Whitfield family, do you know them?" He said old Whitfield had passed 2 winters back. His daughter Rowena ran the property now, about 4 miles east over the ridge. She looked at the company name at the bottom of the page. Cascade Timber Partners, Portland. She said, "Do you know if they're still operating?" He said he didn't know. She closed the notebook carefully and set it beside the ledger. She said she would need paper and a pen, and she wanted to look at that South Timber before the light was gone. He gave her the paper without asking why. The South Timber was everything the notebook described, and then some. She walked the tree line for 2 hours, while he showed her where his brother had staked the survey points. The fir was old growth, the kind that took 3 men with arms spread to circle, and it went back further than she could see through the afternoon gray. She put her hand against one trunk and felt the scale of it. This was not a stand that would run out in a season. Managed with care, it could run for 30 years. She said very little while they walked. She looked at the root structure where the ground exposed it at the creek crossing. She looked at the slope and the drainage and the distance to the mill pond. She studied the way the branches had grown toward light, which told her about weather patterns and prevailing wind. He walked beside her without commentary. When they came back out to the road, she stopped at the edge of the ridge and turned to look down at the mill. The pond, the shed, the canvas patch catching the last light. She could see the whole property from here in a way that was impossible when standing inside it. She said, "Your brother wasn't trying to save the mill. He was trying to double it." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, he always thought bigger than the ground under him. She heard the grief in that, and the affection beneath the grief, and the particular weight of surviving someone who was better at the thing that mattered most. She understood that weight without saying so. They walked back in the darkening without talking. At the yard, he split toward the oxen pen. She went into the office and turned the lamp up as high as it would go and wrote 3 letters before the oil ran low. The first went to Cascade Timber Partners in Portland. The second to a man she had met briefly in Corvallis 2 years back who knew the Portland timber market the way she knew drainage patterns and boardfoot yield. She asked him what he knew about Cascade Timber Partners and asked for his reply by the fastest post. The third letter she considered the longest before she wrote it. It was to Rowena Whitfield, 4 miles east on the other side of the ridge. She did not explain everything. She explained enough. She said she was the new manager at the mill and believed there had been an ongoing conversation between the previous owner and Miss Whitfield that had not been concluded, and that she would like to continue it if Miss Whitfield was willing. She sealed all 3 letters and set them on the edge of the desk and put on her coat and walked to the barn. He was forking hay to the oxen by lantern light. The barn was warm in the way barns with enough animals always are. a slow, deep warmth that settled in the straw and in the smell of it. She stood in the door and watched him work for a moment. He moved differently here than he had at the desk. Here the steadiness in him had somewhere to go. She said she would need funds for a trip to Portland. He stopped forking. He looked at her over the back of the nearest ox. She said, "I need to go in person. A letter will take too long and the contract deadline won't wait." He said slowly, "What makes you think they'll see you?" She said, "Your brother's notebook. The terms are in his hand. Any company that was serious about that deal will at least want to look at it." He set the fork against the wall. He said he didn't understand why the company would still be interested. His brother had been gone 8 months and no one had followed up. She said, "No one who knew about this deal could follow up. You didn't know it existed, and the company may have assumed your brother simply went silent." She paused. "They may have filed it away as unfinished, not dead." She watched that land on him. He asked how long she'd be gone. She said 3 days, maybe 4. She said she would need a letter authorizing her to negotiate on behalf of the mill. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't name exactly. It was not reluctance. It was closer to the expression of a man realizing that someone else is willing to go somewhere he doesn't know how to go and is willing to trust that. He said he'd write the letter tonight. She said thank you and turned to go. He said her name once quietly. She turned back. He said, "Why are you doing this?" She looked at him across the warm dark of the barn. She said, "Because your brother walked that south timber 8 times and wrote down his findings every time. A man who does that is not building something to fail." She looked at the lantern for a moment, then back at him, and "I've seen enough stopped things that weren't finished." She went back to the office. She did not look up from the desk until the lamp oil ran low. Rowena Whitfield rode over the next morning before the crew arrived. She was a tall woman in her late 40s, with a way of taking in a room that suggested she had run things on her own for long enough that she no longer thought about it. She accepted coffee and looked at the notebook for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said her father had told her about the conversations with the previous owner. She had assumed it was finished when she heard he'd died. She said the land was still not for sale, but the cutting agreement was something she'd consider if the terms were right. She left before noon. She was not warm and she was not cold. She was a woman who had made every significant decision in her life without anyone's help and had no plans to stop. Portland in December was gray and wet, and the offices of Cascade Timber Partners were on the 3rd floor of a Front Street building that smelled of pine resin and coal smoke. She was kept waiting 40 minutes after her arrival, which she had expected. She waited without visible impatience, because impatience was information you did not need to give away before a negotiation. The man who came out to bring her in was younger than the company's stationery had suggested. Perhaps 40, with an organized desk and the posture of someone who distrusted disorder. He looked at the letter of authorization, then at her. He said the letter said she was the manager. She said yes. He said, "Not family." She said, "The owner is managing the timber side. He asked me to handle the contractual end because that is what I was hired to do." She set the notebook on his desk. "This is your previous correspondence with the former owner, written in his hand. The terms he worked out are on the last 3 pages." He read the notebook slowly. She watched his face rather than the notebook. His expression when he reached the last pages was not surprise. It was closer to relief, the look of a man finding something he had filed away as lost. He asked about the South Timber acreage. She told him the estimated volume and the cutting agreement she had discussed with Rowena Whitfield, terms still to be finalized, but the principal agreed. He asked about mill capacity. She told him what she had observed in her first days, what repairs were needed, and how long. He said, "You've been there how long?" She said, 5 days. He looked at her for a long moment. He said the company had been interested in the supply arrangement and had assumed the negotiations had simply died with the previous owner. He said he would like to continue them. She said she would like that too if the terms were fair. They talked for 3 hours. She answered every question directly and did not speculate about things she didn't know, which he seemed to notice. By late afternoon, there was a letter of intent on his desk and her signature beside his. She walked back to her hotel through the rain. She found a quiet table in the dining room and ordered supper and sat with the copy of the letter in front of her without reading it. She already knew what it said. She ate without hurry and looked out the window at the gray city and the river beyond it, and she let the tiredness come in now that there was nothing left to hold up. She was back at the mill by Thursday evening. He was in the yard when she came up the road, carrying a plank toward the flume. She told him the letter of intent was signed. She told him the terms. He stood with the plank across his shoulder and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. He said his brother had thought it was possible. She said he was right. He didn't say anything else for a while. He set the plank down and turned to look at the mill. She looked with him. The canvas patch on the roof had been taken down while she was gone. Proper shingles had replaced it on one side, the nail work close and even. She said, "How long did that section take you?" He said, 2 days. She looked at the angle of the work, solid, not fine, but true. She said they could have the flume repaired and the blade running inside a week if they started in the morning. He said they could start tonight if she wasn't too tired. She said she wasn't. That was the truth. The mill ran its first cut of the season the following Wednesday. She stood in the sawshed and felt the water pressure build through the repaired flume, felt the sound rise from a low hum to something that filled the whole building and came up through the floor into her boots. He was at the feed controls. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the blade. The first log went through clean, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. 24 years later, a lumber agent passing through on his way from Portland South stopped at the mill to inquire about pricing on finished planks. The mill had grown since those early years. 3 saws running, a new kiln shed on the east side, a planing operation the agent's own company had been watching with professional interest for 2 seasons. He asked the young clerk at the front counter who owned the place. The clerk pointed through the window toward the yard, where a woman was crossing from the timber office toward the log deck with a ledger under her arm and a conversation already going with the foreman walking beside her. She moved the way people move when they have known exactly where they are going for a very long time. The agent asked how long she'd been running it. Clerk thought about it. He said she had come in November, a long time back, when the main flume was out and the mill was behind on its contracts and things were not looking good. He said she had gone to Portland and come back with a deal that changed the direction of everything. The agent asked what she'd been like when she arrived. The clerk considered that. He said he'd only heard it from people who were there. He said they told it differently, the way people do when the thing being told has been told many times. But the part they all agreed on was this. She had come in, looked at what was broken, looked at what was still whole, and known immediately which one mattered more. The agent watched her stop at the edge of the log deck and lay her hand on a length of timber with the practiced attention of someone assessing what the wood knows about itself. She said something to the foreman. He nodded and went. The agent said she must have known what she was looking at even then. The clerk said she had. He said she'd told his father once, years after, that the hardest part wasn't the contract in Portland or the Whitfield negotiation or getting the blade running in winter. He said she'd told him the hardest part was walking into a place full of stopped things and understanding before anything else that stopped was not the same as finished. The agent said he supposed that made all the difference. The clerk said he supposed it had.